Hello and welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show. I'm Catherine Camp, your hostess for the show. And as you know, this is where we dig into difficult topics of our day and sometimes not so difficult. But today it's going to be a tricky topic because it runs across our headlines and every day. And not only that, it is a bit of an argument in the church. We're going to talk about Israel and its standing before God right now. We're going to talk about replacement theology, and I have the perfect guest for this. He is Dr. Douglas Hamp. He is so knowledgeable about ancient languages. Like he says, he knows enough to go way back in ancient Mesopotamia to be very dangerous. And I think that's wonderful. We need more academics like this. So I'm going to bring him on. He's been on our show before, and I'm just so grateful to God that he's willing to come back and take time to share about these important topics. So let me get him on. Welcome back to the Faith and Culture Show, Dr. Hamp.
Thanks for having me again. It's great to be here.
Well, you know a lot about this because you study Old Testament, Hebrew. I know you study both, obviously, but you do look into the scriptures from the language point of view. And I think that's really important for us to get context about what's going on. And I think what really pushed me over the edge to go ahead and start talking about this was I was at a conference in Tennessee, I don't know, a few months ago. And I was sitting at a table with some very nice people who mean well. And they are convinced that in replacement theology, and that is that the church is the new Israel. And that's why I'm real glad that you're here to talk with us about this. So just tell me, I know you have a new book too that really touches on this topic, which is such perfect timing. Where would you like to start? Because you're the expert in this.
Well, Israel's a very big topic, but it is the main topic. I mean, of the Bible from Genesis 12 to Revelation 22, it's all about Israel. So if we don't get our Israelology right, we're going to miss a lot of the Bible. And we've had roughly 2,000 years of misdirection, misappropriation of the term, misuse of the term, and just some plain perversion of the term, so that we're all kind of confused on this. And that's why I wrote this book. This is a book that I have been really working on for probably about 12, 13 years. It's one of those books that it's just been, I don't know if it's been growing or festering in my heart, but it's definitely been in there as something has wanted to come out. And I've taught it in many different ways. And I'm happy that I got it finally in a book form. And it's called God's Divorce, the Bible's Hidden Love Story. And, you know, I start with this provocative question. What if the gospel was not about starting something new, but about restoring something ancient? And I think this is very apropos for, you know, what you wanted to talk about as well, which is, of course, the modern state of Israel. And it all goes together. That's the thing, is some people think that, oh, we're the church and there's the Jews over there or Israel over there. And, you know, we're sort of very distant cousins, but we're not that close. And then there's others who are in the replacement theology camp that say, Israel? Yes, that's us. And the Jews have nothing to do with that. And so there's these competing ideas as to what that means exactly. And then, of course, that bleeds over into how we approach the modern state of Israel. Now, here's a full disclosure. I grew up as a dispensationalist. I was told that Israel and the Jews were essentially synonymous, and that, you know, if you're talking about the Jews, you're talking about Israel. Talking about Israel, you're talking about the Jews. And I learned that I was part of the church. And when I heard about replacement theology, I'm like, that's ridiculous. Clearly, God still has a plan for his people. And that was correct. But it was it was incomplete. Let's just put it that way. And it's funny because one of the major things that helped me see this, as I was teaching a course on Calvinism on the question of election. And in my paper, I suggested that God did not elect Calvinists. That was the title of my paper. And I was trying to show that God had elected Israel. And I think I did a pretty good job in my paper. But what I was missing is that I thought the Jews in Israel were synonymous, and it did not include the church. So I was also wrong. And it's one of these things that took me so long to finally put the pieces together. But man, I'll tell you, once I started seeing these things, everything started fitting into place. And all of those really weird, hard to discern Pauline passages, they just started to jump off the page at me because it started to make sense. And suddenly it wasn't God being done with Israel, or God replacing Israel, or God finding a new wife called the church, but it was God in all of his mercy, seeking out the one that he had loved, that he had promised to bless, and that was unfaithful to him from the very onset. And then after 7 centuries of marriage counseling, it still didn't work out. And God said, okay, honey, if you want those other gods, go for it. I'm no longer your God. You're no longer my people. And he let them go, and they were dispersed, and they became part of the nations. And then it was him coming back to die for this wife, this estranged wife that could never come back because of the law. And so all these things go into this bigger question of, who's Israel, and what is God's relationship with her? That it's at the very core of the Bible. And what it did for me is, well, it humbled me in a lot of my my understandings of who I thought God was. It helped me understand how even more gracious God is, how patient God is, and how none of us deserve anything from God's hand, but God is the gracious one, and he found a way to bring Israel back, and that includes me. So that was it was quite a moment when I started putting all these pieces together, and it just took a while, to undo a lot of the theology that I had grown up with, and to kind of put it in its biblical context.
And I think that's what's happening to a lot of people today. In fact, this is on the side, but my ministry, I make T-shirts that say Jesus is Lord, and I sell them for donation. And I wore one to the gym this weekend, and I think it ruffled a lot of feathers. One man after class made sure to tell me that he was okay, and I had said nothing. That he was okay because he was born a Roman Catholic, and his priest told him he was fine. He was good to go. Oh, and also he was infant baptized, so he was good to go. I don't think this man has probably stepped into a church for who knows how long, just from our previous conversations in the past. Anyhow, I just thought, all of this, it plays into what's going on, and this misunderstanding of the church. And I want to ask you, wasn't there a prophet, and I want to say it was Haggai, but I could be wrong. Anyhow, or you'll tell us, who God had him marry a prostitute, and then he had to go back to her, even though she went to live somewhere else after many times of prostituting herself. And then God said, go back and claim her back. Right. Who was that?
That was Hosea.
Hosea.
Hosea and Gomer. Yeah.
Okay.
Hosea
there we go.
Yeah. And so here's the thing. God takes Israel out of Egypt around 1446, somewhere in there, BC. They go to Mount Sinai. They enter into a marriage contract. So when we think about the old covenant, we're thinking about a marriage contract. That happened on the feast of Shavuot, which we call Pentecost. And it was an amazing celebration. Well, shortly thereafter, on the honeymoon, Israel is already going after the golden calf. This clearly breaks their marriage vows that she said, all that the Lord has said we will do. And God said, don't have any other gods before me. Well, what did she do? She went after other gods immediately. So God was already gracious right there. And then the kingdom, United Kingdom, split after the days of King Solomon. And that's when it became known as the House of Judah and the House of Israel. I mean, they were called that before, but that's when they became two separate kingdoms, House of Israel, House of Judah. So the House of Israel was the 10 tribes. They were in the north. They became known as Israel. And they went from around 932 BC till about 722 BC. And they kept going from bad to worse. They kept going after all these other gods. God sent prophets to call them back until finally he just said, okay, that's it. And Hosea was the one who, poor guy, he had to live this out as a living example, a living testimony of what Israel had been doing to God. And yeah, he was called to marry this prostitute, and she kept running away until finally he actually bought her. And it's in the book of Hosea where God makes these startling declarations. He says that I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will have mercy on the house of Judah. He said it will be said to them in the place where it said, you are no longer the sons of the living God, that you are the sons of the living God. In chapter 2, he says, tell her that she's not my wife and I'm not her husband. You're not my people and I'm not your God. And then he says that I will woo her and I will bring her to me and I will betroth her to me in righteousness forever. So this is the capstone book for understanding that God divorced Israel. For people who are wondering, okay, where is this divorce certificate? Well, it's in Jeremiah 3, verse 8. He says that he gave the house of Israel a certificate of divorce. And then in the same book of Jeremiah, chapter 31, he is speaking, he says, speaking tenderly of Ephraim, which is the house of Israel. He says that, is not Ephraim my dear son? And that, how much he loves Ephraim. And then he says that the days are coming, says the Lord, when I'll make a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah, not according to the covenant I made with their fathers when I took them by the hand to lead them out of the land of Egypt, my covenant which they broke, though I was a husband to them. But this is the covenant I'll make with the house of Israel in those days. I'll put my law in their minds and I'll write it in their hearts. So we see Jeremiah. That the new covenant is all about, it's all about this marriage, because the old covenant was a marriage contract that broke, that ended in divorce. And the new marriage contract was because of what Yeshua, our Messiah, did for us on the cross.
And that's Jeremiah 31?
Yeah, 31 through 33.
Okay. These things are very important for us to understand, because like you said, this is something that without this background, it would be easy to think, well, they rejected him and then they read something like Jeremiah 3:8 and say, well, see, it says right here, he's leaving them. And so now we're the ones who replace it. So this is so important to understand this language. And Hosea always struck me as, wow, this is amazing what he's doing. But as always, God has a message, and it's timeless. And so we can look back on it in the 21st century And we should be realizing, okay, this is what it's about. We're all in this together. A lot of people don't realize that even in the Old Testament, God reached out. When there were Gentiles or pagans, whatever you want to call them, who would like Ruth, who said, my people will be your people. Your God will be my God. And I'm probably twisting that around, but he would take them right in. So it's never been that God stiff-armed anybody. Anyone who had a heart for God was accepted.
Yes. Yeah, always. Always. We see the mixed multitude that came out of Egypt. They did not remain the mixed multitude tribe. They didn't have their own special land designation. They were simply assimilated into Israel, and they became part of the national identity. And this is where it gets really interesting, because when we start looking at the epistles of Paul, this is kind of what blew my mind so many years ago, and still does to this day, because these were passages that I could not make sense of. And yet, when I started understanding this bigger picture, I began to see this thing emerge, and it blew my mind. Paul says in Ephesians 2:11, therefore remember that you, once Gentiles in the flesh, that at that time you were without Christ, being aliens from the commonwealth of Israel and strangers from the covenants of promise, having no hope and without God in the world. So who's he talking to? Well, Gentiles. He tells us very clearly. He's talking to Gentiles. And what is he saying to these Gentiles? He says that you were aliens from the commonwealth of Israel. Well, you're not aliens anymore from the commonwealth of Israel. He says, but now in Christ Jesus, you who were far off, that's a term that we find in the book of Daniel, in his prayer, Daniel chapter 9. He's speaking to the men of Judah, Jerusalem, Judah, and those far off. So those who are near and those who are far off. He's talking about both houses of Israel, the house of Judah and the house of Israel in the north, that had already been declared a non-people, that had been sent away. And he's talking about those people. Paul's talking about the same people. He says, for he himself is our peace, who has made both one, and has broken down the middle wall of separation, having abolished in his flesh the enmity, that is the law of commandments contained in ordinances, so as to create in himself one new man from the two, thus making peace. So what happens is people read Paul without any context, which is most of us for the last 2,000 years. We say, oh, well, see, he's gotten rid of the law. Jesus came to die and to replace the law. But that's not what Paul is saying. I think Paul is spitting in his grave, quite frankly, because Paul has been so misquoted. It's insane.
Oh, yeah.
But Paul is talking about the law of commandments contained in ordinances. Well, what is he talking about? He's talking about Deuteronomy 24, where it talks about if a man has a wife and he finds some ervat davar, some unclean thing in her, and he gives her a certificate of divorce and sends her out of his house, and she becomes another man's wife, and she gets divorced from him as well, then she cannot go back to the first husband. That would be an abomination, and it would greatly pollute the land. This is a big deal. And so what Paul is getting at here is he's explaining legally how Jesus made it possible for the Gentiles to come into the faith. But there's a caveat, and this is where you have to go back and study the Old Testament. And I really do think that all New Testament students should be required to have an incredible foundation in the prophets and in the law. Because if you don't understand that stuff, it's just not going to make sense. You're not going to understand what Paul is getting at. Listen to what he says. He says that he might reconcile them both to God in one body through the cross, thereby putting to death the enmity. And he came and preached peace to you who were afar off. Again, that's talking about the house of Israel. For through him we both have access by one Spirit to the Father. Now, therefore, you are no longer strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints, so that we're now brought into this commonwealth of Israel. And he makes it even clearer, I would say, in Romans chapter 7. Again, this is one of these passages where a lot of pastors and theologians say, well, Paul is just sort of kind of pulling a metaphor out of the air, and he's talking about marriage. But he's not talking about, he's not talking about Israel or anything like that. But let's listen. He says, do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law. All right, that's our first clue. He's speaking to people, to believers who know the Torah, who know the law, not Roman law, not Greek law, but Torah, God's law.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And so he's assuming that they have a good understanding, a working knowledge of God's law. He says that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives. For the woman who has a husband is bound by the law to her husband as long as he lives. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. Again, this is directly from Deuteronomy 24. So he's saying that the woman is released not from the law in general, but from the law of her husband. The law of her husband, that's what she's released from. So then, while her husband lives, she marries another man, she'll be called an adulteress. But if her husband dies, she's free from that law. Again, not the Torah at large, not the 10 Commandments. I mean, I've seen memes where the 10 Commandments are nailed behind the hands of Jesus. It just drives me bananas. And these are well-meaning Christians. They're well-meaning Christians, but they're like, see, the law was done away with. I'm like, no, man, no, that's ridiculous.
Wow.
It's just ridiculous.
No, in fact,
point.
Yeah. Sorry.
I mean, you cannot get away. You can't do away with God's laws because they're not just things that God came up with over a weekend and said, well, gosh, what should I do? And what should I tell people to do? No, God revealed his laws because they're the laws of how things work. Look, when a physicist goes out and discovers a law of nature, it's not like this guy came up with it, like he kind of thought about it, hummed and hawed and said, maybe the law should be this way. No. It's merely a description of how the universe works.
Yeah.
And that's what God's, excuse me, that's what his laws are. They're simply a description of how it works. But so many people have this idea in their minds that God's laws are similar to how Congress comes up with laws, that, there's a bunch of people sitting in a room and they vote on whether we should do this or do that, or whether we should, have a way for the, endangered eagles to be taken care of or not, and those kinds of things where they're just man-made laws. They can be made, they can be repealed, but God's law is not like that. God's law is a description of how the universe is. So he's saying that if her husband dies, she's free from the law of the marriage, so that she's no adulteress, though she's married another man. Therefore, my brethren, you also have become dead to the law of the husband through the body of Christ, that you may be married to another, to him who was raised from the dead, that we should bear fruit to God. This is huge. Yeah. Paul's saying, don't you get it? You were, you could not come into covenant relationship because of what happened through Israel. Now, this is where people say, well, wait, I don't understand because I don't have any relationship to Israel. So what are you talking about? Well, let's go back. In Hosea chapter 1 and 2, God says, you're no longer my people, but I'm going to bring you back to me and I'm going to betroth you to me in righteousness. What happened to the northern kingdom of Israel? They were taken away captive by the Assyrians, and the Assyrians had this policy that they would take people from country A and put them into country B, and people from country B put them in country A. And because you were not living in your own homeland, your own fatherland anymore, there would be less likelihood of a rebellion. And so basically, God legally said to Israel, "You're not my people anymore." And then they got kind of shaken and stirred and just thrown into the nations. It says in Hosea, it says that you will become wanderers among the nations. You will become assimilated or swallowed up by the nations. There's all this language of them just becoming part of the nations, right? They're no longer special. They don't have any special markings. They just become one of a billion, one of 10 million, whatever, right? They just become just like everybody else. They're not special anymore. So when God says that he's going to bring them back, but now they've become part of the nations, it's like if I take a drop of a coffee or a wine and I put it in my water. Let's say the wine represents Israel, and I drop it into the water, which represents the nations. Well, you know where it went, but how do I get that out? I don't. It now becomes part of the admixture. It's not part of it. So when someone from the nations comes to faith in Christ, they're now becoming part of the commonwealth of Israel. They're becoming part of the house of Israel. And this is how God is doing it. So it's not about genetics. Some people think, oh, there's some genetic thing, or others think that we're going to find the missing tribes of the missing 10 tribes. I think we already found them. It's called the church, right? But people would say, well, that's replacement theology. No, it's different, because replacement theology says that God was done with Israel, and now he's transferred all the blessings to the church. And so, this is sort of Israel 2.0, if you will. But that's not what God is talking about.
Right. And we hear over and over and over again that there will always be a remnant. Always. And we know that Jesus was seen as the remnant. And please correct me if I'm off on that. I want correction, because I never want to, mislead anybody. And so that's why we come in under Jesus, everything he did on the cross for us. And but even in Scripture, even in the New Testament, it shows that the Jews were first, and Paul even says that it's to the Jews first, and then to the Gentiles, because God has a heart for the Jewish people. Now, are we talking about the same thing? You mentioned in the beginning the difference. There's a difference between the Jews and Israel. Can you tell us about that, or if there is no difference?
No, there definitely is a difference.
Okay.
There very clearly is a difference. So let's go back to the book of Hosea in chapter 1. So remember, when God took Israel out of Egypt, they were one united people, right? There were 12 tribes plus the mixed multitude that was sprinkled in, and they were one people. We eventually have the united monarchy under Saul, and then David and Solomon. And then after Solomon, because he was quite wicked, he went after a lot of false gods. God split the kingdom, and it became known as the house of Israel and the house of Judah. That's something a lot of people know. They know it historically, like I knew it historically for the longest time, but I didn't understand it theologically. I didn't understand why that was such a big deal, and it's a really big deal. All right, and so the northern kingdom of Israel, and you can read about it in the books of the Kings and Chronicles, and all the stuff that Elijah was doing, that was to the northern kingdom of Israel. God continued to call the northern kingdom of Israel to come back to him, to come back, and they would not. And so eventually he says, right, thinking of Hosea and these kids that he has, right? So God says, okay, name your first kid Yezreel, because God will scatter Israel. And then call your second kid Lo Ruchama, no mercy. And then your third kid, Lo Ami. These are the names of his kids. I mean, these are really strange names for kids.
Yeah.
He says, so call her Lo Ruchama, for I will no longer have mercy on the house of Israel, but I will utterly take them away. Yet I will have mercy on the house of Judah, will save them by the Lord their God, and will not save them by bow, etc. So he makes it very clear that he's going to have no mercy on Israel, yes, mercy on Judah. So Judah, those are the Jews, the house of Judah. They become known as the Jews. All right. And certainly God has wonderful plans for Judah. They are very much part of his equation, big time. All right. But since we're focusing on the house of Israel at the moment, and that God divorced her, he didn't divorce Judah, but he did divorce the house of Israel. I mean, let me just take you back here to Jeremiah. This is, I mean, it's so powerful, you know, and I'd love to tell you that it's easy to see, but it took me forever to understand these things. That's why I wrote a book, because it took a long time to connect all these dots. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. That's the important part. So Jeremiah 3, they say, if a man divorces his wife and she goes from him and becomes another man's, may he return to her again. Would not that land be greatly polluted? But you've played the harlot with many lovers, says the Lord, yet return to me. And, you know, he goes and he says, you've been with all these different men, and et cetera, et cetera. And he goes and says in verse 7, and I said, after she had done all these things, return to me. But she did not return, speaking of Israel. And her treacherous sister Judah saw it. Then I saw that for all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I had put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but went and played the harlot also. I remember when I was going through Jeremiah and the book of Ezekiel years ago, and it really struck me for the first time. I'm like, wait a second, there's a huge theological difference between the house of Israel and the house of Judah. I just kind of thought, okay, you know, yeah, one blew it, the other one didn't, whatever. But then I began to realize, like, oh, like this is the story. The story of scattering to the nations was prophesied to Israel. God did it. He scattered them to the nations. And then the story of, or the prophecy of regathering them, that was also told to Israel. And so when we understand that this happened to Israel and that Jesus came back to make it legally possible for Israel to come back. Now, people say, well, you know, couldn't the northern kingdom just become part of Judah? Well, some of them did. Some moved south. But just because they rented a flat next to some people in Jerusalem didn't change their legal status. Their legal status remained not my people. And there was only one way for that to be undone, and that was for the husband to die. That's the radical thing here, is that legally, no matter how much mercy God could show, and they could hang out with their Jewish neighbors, they still weren't a people. They were still outcasts legally. And because they had been swallowed up by the nations, they'd become part of the Gentiles, they were no longer distinguishable. There was nothing special about them that would set them apart. There was nothing that separated them, that made them any different than their Gentile neighbors. They were just Gentiles. And so it was Yeshua going to the cross that allowed them to come back together. In the book of Ezekiel, chapter 37, we know the story of the dry bones, right? And that prophecy, there's songs written about that. But if you continue in that same chapter, he talks about two sticks. There's a stick of Judah and the stick of Israel. And he says, put them together in your hand, son of man, for they will become one stick in my hand, and they will never be two nations ever again. And it's the restoration of these two nations that had been long prophesied. And this is what Paul is getting at. So if you come at the New Testament, especially the Pauline epistles, suggesting that, you know, Paul is just explaining how to be saved and all this kind of stuff, and there's no relationship to the Old Testament or to Israel, you're going to be very confused. But really what Paul is doing is he's pulling all these things together, and he's saying, look, this is how God fixed the problem that Israel had, because Israel had been divorced. She could not come back legally. There was no way for her to become part of this covenant relationship again. I mean, look, if you're married to God and then God says, okay, I'm divorcing you, and then you go and are with other gods, and then that doesn't work out, there's no way to go back, because the only option left is for God to die. And that's a pretty long shot, isn't it? I mean, God doesn't die.
Wow.
Or does he? And see, this is the beautiful thing. So we go back, here God is in love with Israel. He takes her out of Egypt. They meet at Mount Sinai, and it's a marriage proposal. A lot of people think of Charlton Heston and the Ten Commandments movie, and that this is simply where God said, okay, here's my laws, and take it or leave it.
Right.
But it was a proposal. It was God who was in love with his people. And he said, you're going to be a special treasure to me above all the people on the face of the earth. And Israel said, all that the Lord has said we will do. She said, I do, right? She said, I do. Those were marriage proposals. The Jews have long understood this. They've long understood that what happened at Mount Sinai was a marriage. How that got lost in the church, I don't know. But it did get lost. We've not thought about that. We don't think about the feast. We don't think about Pentecost.
Yeah,
we think, that's the birthday of the church. Like, not really, man. It's really, it's a marriage. That's what Pentecost, Shavuot, is all about. And it's the restoration of Israel, of the scattered bride. It's the restoration and the calling back of the bride that had been divorced, that had no chance to come back, was without hope in this world to come back in fellowship and covenant relationship with God. This is how he did it. And so it puts a whole different perspective on this story. And it's not that God was a mean God in the Old Testament. Now he's this real loving God in the New Testament. It's the same God,
right,
through and through and through.
Right.
And he's not starting over. He's not just some, God got tired of Israel. I'm done with you, Israel. I'm going to go find some different wife called the church. That's what a lot of people think. That
they do.
Start over.
They do. I have a couple questions, if I may, Dr. Hamp. I feel like I'm in class, which would be awesome. I love learning. Were the people, when Paul is speaking to the people, and I'm looking here to see where he's speaking, what you talk about, but were those people, his audience, aware of this, that they couldn't come back into relationship? For instance, was there a big thing about it where the Pharisees and the Sadducees, I know, popped up during the intertestamental period? So was there a thing like they didn't want to, that Israel, they shunned them, and that everyone in the, were Jews, like the Sadducees and the Pharisees? Were they from the tribe of Judah, or were they, or not, maybe not the tribe, but from Judah, because they had been in Babylon and they just kind of shunned the people who used to be in Israel? I mean, what was the extent of their understanding?
Well, Israel was gone. I mean, Israel had been taken away since 722 BC. Right. So they were just not a people. They, I don't know. It's just kind of like, I live in Colorado. If the whole state gets emptied out, and we're taken to Australia, and, but a few stragglers happen to make it, some make it to the surrounding states, some make it over to Kansas, and they take a, Kansas citizenship or statehood, but your heart is in Colorado. That's who you were, right? So Israel was gone. Like, that's the important part to understand. So for, the last 7 centuries, it had only been Judah. That was the only show in town. Was
Wow.
Judah. And Judah had been keeping these promises and the hope alive. You can see it in the 18 Amidot. These are the prayers that are recited every Shabbat. These are things that we recite every Shabbat, in part at the Way congregation. It talks about the regathering of the dispersed of Israel, that God is going to bring them back. And so this hope has been kept alive. But there were certainly a number of misunderstandings about how that would happen, and it took time. And what's really amazing is that Peter would have had this same understanding that they were going to come back, but he didn't understand how God was going to do it. That dream that Peter has in Acts chapter 10, right, where he's on top of the roof of Simon the tanner's house, and the sheet is dropped, and it's got all kinds of unclean animals, and he hears in the dream, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And he says, "Not so, Lord. I don't eat unclean stuff." And then he wakes up, and he's like, that was a weird dream. Mm-hmm. And there's a knock at the door, right? Now, this is where a lot of Christians think that Peter got a message from God that now he's allowed to eat pork, right? Because, see, you're supposed to eat whatever's in the sheet. But Peter did not come to that conclusion. Okay. Peter wakes up, he goes to the door. Who does he find there? 3 Gentiles. And they say, "Hey, Cornelius has called us. Please come to his house." The Spirit says, "Go, Peter." So he goes. He's just kind of in a daze. He's taking it all in. He's seeing the Spirit move in the house of Cornelius. And then in verse 28, he says, "Oh, I get it. God has shown me not to call any man common or unclean." That whole thing was about Peter thinking that Gentiles were icky, were unclean. They were untouchables. And it would take another encounter with Paul in Antioch when Peter was hanging out with Gentiles, but then when certain Jews would come from Jerusalem, he would remove himself and not hang out with them anymore. And so Paul had to call him on the carpet and said, "What are you doing, Peter? Either you can hang out with Gentiles or you can't. Which is it?" And he totally had to call him on the carpet. And it's because Peter had this cultural bias that he did not associate with Gentiles. And the Pharisees, you asked about the Pharisees and the Sadducees. Well, they were all very Jewish. They were not Gentile whatsoever. They were right, and they were not Israel. They were Jewish. Okay. And so while they had this hope of the restoration of the house of Israel, but they didn't understand how it was going to happen at all. In fact, after Jesus rises in the book of Acts, chapter 1, they say, "Lord, will you now at this time restore the kingdom to Israel?" I used to read that thinking, are they saying, "Are you going to kick out the Romans now?" But that's not what they were asking. They were asking, "Are you going to restore the house of Israel that had been taken away? Are you going to undo the split between Israel and Judah?" And essentially, Jesus had given the answer already. Go into the nations, take the good news, teach them the things that I've been teaching you, proclaim the good news of the kingdom of God. And so the answer was, well, yeah, but it's not going to be the way that you think it is, because the house of Israel isn't hiding behind a mountain. They're not stuck in Ethiopia. They're not, in some place where nobody has looked, but they're everywhere. They're us. They were assimilated into the nations. And so there's no distinction anymore between a Gentile and someone from the house of Israel. They became one and the same. They were completely swallowed up. And so part of the problem is that our nomenclature suggests that the Jews are Israel and Israel are the Jews. And until you can have some light of day between those terms, you're not going to understand the distinction. And that's what I suffered from, is that I just assumed that Israel and Judah were exactly the same theologically.
Yeah.
Historically I understood it, but theologically I didn't get it. And it took me a long time to finally see that light of day. And once I did, I was like, oh my goodness, it's everywhere. And you begin to see it in Jeremiah, you begin to see it in Ezekiel, and then you begin to see it in the writings of Paul. And I don't know how else to say it. I mean, it's just so earth-shattering when it finally comes into perspective. And then Paul's writings really begin to make a lot of sense.
I would think so, because I always want to look at things in context and really try to understand what were they hearing, because I don't think that they had as many voices and were being tugged like we are now in the 21st century. It says this, it says that. They pretty much had a handle on it, those who were Jewish, and those who were Gentiles were just learning for the first time, so they were just taking it all in, and I guess they were being tugged by whatever else they had learned with the pagan gods and such. So yeah, this is, I'm really trying to wrap my head around all of this. So moving into, unless you think we need to, and this might come up, but when people look at the nation of Israel, they look at the map and they see this little piece of land that's about the size of New Jersey, I think. Is it New Jersey or Rhode Island? I can never remember that.
Yeah.
And they think of that as Israel, and that's Israel, and that's a nation. It's, Benjamin Netanyahu has been there forever, kind of running the show. That's a big deal right now. It's like, well, we can't turn our backs on Israel. But I see that the people are separate from the political side of things. Can you work with us on that? Kind of clear things up there, because it's tempting to see, okay, is Netanyahu really a good guy, or is it, he says he loves God, but so do a lot of people who proclaim Christianity, yet they certainly don't act like it, and their behaviors, their decision making is not along the line of what God would has put down for us and how to live, right?
Right.
So what say you?
Well, I think it's important to understand that there are prophetic promises that God made in the scriptures regarding the people as a whole, and then there are political decisions that are being made that God does not necessarily rubber stamp. All right. And I think sometimes there is a tendency to say, well, it's Israel, and so it's God's people, so therefore it must be okay. That's not how this thing works. Not at all. God still wants every nation, including the Jews who currently rule over Israel. He wants them to act in ways that are godly, that are loving, that are according to his ways and his instructions. And, I lived in Israel for 3 years, and I thought they were really a great country, great people, but by no means perfect, and Israelis will be the first to tell you that. It's, if you go and you spend time there, you'll discover that some agree with what Netanyahu is doing, some disagree with what he's doing. It does become obviously complicated because you have this group of people known as Palestinians that have been there for a long time as well, and they have their claims. And, when the British were leaving in 1948, they did not do Israel any favors. They left the land partitioned in such a way that it was quite indefensible. And the moment that they left, you had all these Arab nations that came and attacked Israel straight away. But the one thing that those other nations never did is they never wanted to take responsibility for the people, for the so-called Palestinians. See, everybody up until that point was a Palestinian. If we go back to Caesar Hadrian in the 1st century, he was rather upset at the Jewish people because they had rebelled against Rome in 70 AD. And then some 65 years later, they rebelled again in his day. And it's called the Second Jewish Revolt. It was led by a guy named Bar Kokhba. And he was so upset about that the sheer hubris that they would try to rebel again, that he renamed it from Judea to the name that their enemies had called it, which was Palestine. And that's where that name came from, was Palestine. The name of Jerusalem was changed to Aelia Capitolina. He salted the land. He told the Jews, don't you come back on pain of death. I mean, it was a really radical time. And so the Jews, the house of Judah, they experienced tremendous national heartbreak and upset at that time. And so they have been a wandering people for roughly 2,000 years. And of course, we know the story of that. They have suffered tremendously at the hands of the Russians, that they've suffered at the hands of the Germans. A fun fact, while we like to throw the Nazis under the bus for the Holocaust, as we should, most of Europe didn't want the Jews. In fact, there were a lot of Poles who were saying, hey, we, as much as we don't like what Hitler's doing to Poland, we're sure glad he's taking care of the Jewish problem. This was something that was one of those dirty little secrets that everybody knew about. The French didn't love the Jews. Nobody loved the Jews in Europe. That was the harsh reality, is they needed a place. And so in the fullness of time, I would say that God did an astounding miracle by bringing the Jews back to the land of Israel. Now, the very name Israel is, it's a bit of a luck of the draw. I mean, there were debates as to whether they should name it Judea. Well, they didn't. They named it Israel. Okay. And so here we are. We're stuck with it. And, I think it's okay. I think that it's a name that is prophetic, because it's not going to be just Judea one day. It is going to be the land of Israel for all Israel. So listen to this. This is from Ezekiel chapter 38. A lot of us have studied this passage because it's an end times passage. Yeah. And I was studying this some time ago, and I was looking at it and I'm like, holy cow, look at this. It's amazing what God is saying about his people in the last days. He says, speaking of Israel, the land, he says, after many days you will be visited. Excuse me. In the latter years, you will come into the land of those, actually speaking to Gog, my bad. You'll come into the land of those brought back from the sword and gathered from many people on the mountains of Israel, which had long been desolate. They were brought out of the nations, and now all of them dwell safely. So speaking of Gog, this is the end times bad guy. This is the Antichrist. Okay. He's saying that, in the latter days, you're going to come against Israel. And who you're going to find there? The people who were brought back from the sword from many people. Like, wow, that's amazing, right? So what what Hitler did to the Jews, boy, if that wasn't the sword, I don't know what was the sword, because the Holocaust was the biggest, fattest, most deadly sword in all of history against one particular people. And so that is what that is. I mean, this is just phenomenal. I mean, it's incredible. In fact, before he committed suicide, Hitler penned his last will and testament, and he said to his Germans, keep fighting against the Jews until they're all destroyed. You know, the guy's about to kill himself, and the last thing he has to say is, make sure you get all the Jews. I mean, oh my goodness. Talk about hatred.
I was going to say a
yeah.
black heart. We see a lot of that today happening.
Yeah.
But, okay.
So this is a very complex issue, obviously. All right. So Judah comes back into the land in 1948. They name instead of Palestine, they could now call it Israel. Okay, they call it Israel, but that's just the beginning. All right, it's not the end. If you go back into Ezekiel 39, and then it talks about the house of Israel, how God is going to bring them into the land in the last days. Well, that has not yet happened. The house of Israel has not been brought back into the land of Israel. They're still scattered among the nations. That's us. All right, if you are in Christ, if you have come to faith of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, how did you come into covenant relationship with him? It was through the blood of Christ. It was because the husband that said to the northern kingdom of Israel, you're no longer my people, and gave her a certificate of divorce, then he himself came and he died to cancel that first marriage contract so that divorced Israel could come back into covenant relationship. That's how we're brought into this covenant relationship. But, sometimes prophecy gives us sort of bullet points, but between each bullet point, there could be 50 years, 100 years, 200 years. They take time. They play out in real time. And that's part of our problem, is that we're impatient. We want it all to happen right now.
Right.
And
that's amazing what you just brought up about Ezekiel. And then what Ezekiel was in the 800 BCs before 722?
No, so he was one of the people taken captive in the Babylonian captivity.
So that was 586, after 586.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So here he is. See, this is what I mean. My theology is really good, but I kind of, I need more practice, I guess, or to fit everything into the time slots better. That he would say this about the people being brought back from the sword. That's amazing, because none of them got to see it.
Right.
Yet this is God speaking.
Yep.
This is going to happen.
Yeah.
So it really is important for us to study the scriptures, understand, who God is, but also to be aware of our times and what is going on. That's really cool. That's why I like watching the Prophecy Roundtable that you do on Thursday nights.
Thank you.
It's always educational. Okay, so we look at Israel today. We see it as this small country. It's just a shadow of itself, of what God had originally given the land to the people. But this is how we see it today, and we're living through it. And we see all this hatred toward Israel. And we have, churches and Christians dividing over, there's always this difficulty in talking about, well, the people of Israel. God's people are different from the political, the government, because they're not running the government, and neither are we, as God would require a government of God to be run. So how do you weigh in on something like that? Because even with the recent assassination of Charlie Kirk, this has become a real thing, because with Candace Owen out there saying that it was probably some people related to the deep state of Israel, and you have others saying that's anti-Semitic. How do we have these discussions intelligently?
So rephrase your question. What is it that?
Okay, you've got these personalities discussing that there's like a deep state in Israel, and you have other Christians saying, well, that's just for you to even bring that up is anti-Semitic.
Okay.
And for me, I see the people separate from that, because not all of us, we know there's a shadow government in the United States, and just because we're American, but that's different, because then we're talking about Christians. We're talking about God's chosen people, the ones who respond to him.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so, God's chosen people were chosen not because they were perfect. They were chosen to enter into a marriage relationship. That's what they were chosen for. Now, on top of, in the midst of that, they often made bad choices, and they suffered the consequences for those things. It doesn't mean that they were suddenly unchosen. It just means that they got chastised for whatever decisions that they made. Mm-hmm. In the case of David, he obviously made some pretty bad choices, right? And he got chastised for those choices. But he remained God's chosen king, and he remained the promises that God had made to David remained intact despite David's bad choices. So, I think this is where we have to understand that the nation state of Israel, they can be part of God's chosen people. And again, I want to make it clear that you and I, as believers, we are also part of the commonwealth of Israel. I think Paul makes that very clear in the book of Ephesians. But if we're just talking about the modern nation state of Israel, well, the Jews that live in that land, they are doing their best to ensure their existence, right? And there's a lot of people that want to stamp them out. I think that's pretty clear. Yeah. And, every time someone joins the IDF, they have to go on this hike up to Masada, and they have this little ritual and saying never again, because that's where the Romans came. And, if you know the story of Masada, that's where this last bastion of Jews were holed up, and they were then besieged by the Romans, and they all committed suicide before the Romans could take them. So every Israeli soldier goes up on Masada. They say never again. And they understand that the threat to the Jewish people is real. The hatred for the Jewish people is real. Yeah. That people will take all kinds of actions to try to commit genocide, to decimate the Jewish people. And so, they do have things like Mossad and probably other intel that we haven't even heard of. Okay, so that's what they're doing. But, I also think there's a lot of, I think it's easy to start calling everything a conspiracy. And I'm not picking sides with Candace Owen or any of these other people.
Right.
I typically don't watch those people because I don't think that they're adding anything of real value. But I used to get stuck in the conspiracies as well. And it was just started ruining my life. And
Mm-hmm.
so much of the stuff, I'm not saying that none of it's true. I'm just saying that most of it cannot be proven. Most of it is speculation that gets bigger and bigger and bigger every time it's shared. It becomes more sensational. And before you know it, we have the deep state. Okay, well, who is the deep state? I mean, it depends who you're talking to. It depends when, politician A, B, and C, before they're in office, it's all those other guys. But when they're in office, suddenly they're the deep state. I mean, who is the deep state?
That's
I mean, I don't know. Is it the Illuminati? I don't know. I mean, maybe not, right? And this is where we can just say they are doing all these bad things. Like, well, yeah, whoever they are, I'm sure they're doing some bad things. But who are they? And what happens is the reason that conspiracies are so popular is it shifts the blame. It's not my fault, but it's the Illuminati's fault. It's not the American people's fault. It's all the Illuminati. Or here's one, all the Republicans are saints, but all the Democrats are demons. I mean, that's what I hear all the time. The Democrats. And I think it's so incredibly irresponsible to start talking like this. But it's fun because I don't take any responsibility. And if it weren't for the Democrats, our country would be amazing. We'd be like a utopia, but we all know that's not true.
Yeah, I don't think so.
Both sides of this have their issues. The Democrats, they got lots of issues for sure. Well, man, so do the Republicans. You know why? Because we're all human and we're all getting played. There's something called the Hegelian dialectic. And the basic idea is that you have a thesis, you have an antithesis, and then you have a synthesis. In other words, if I want the synthesis, if I want outcome A, what I do is I then create a little problem over here. And then there's other group has this problem over here because they're reacting to it. And then these two clash. And then we get this synthesis. That's basically what's happening is you got left versus right. You got blue versus red, and one is against the other. They both think that they're right. They think the other one is absolutely wrong. But what if we're all getting played? That's what I would suggest. I don't think it's just, God is on the side of the Republicans and he's against all Democrats. That's just not true. I know a lot of godly Democrats. I know that's even blasphemous to say that, but it's true.
Don't we have... wouldn't you say, okay, so basically we can take this back to Israel and we've got a mixture there. And just like with us, like you made your point, there's a mixture of everything. And this is where I always go to, all right, we all have a common enemy, and that's Satan. He's our adversary of all humanity, and he takes joy. He loves the Hegelian dialect. He loves how divisiveness, if that is, if we're not strong enough in our faith, we can see this in the church as well. And that's difficult. I know you don't watch a lot of things because you're very busy and you're too busy researching stuff. And that's the point where I want to get back to doing research on the pagan world. That's kind of how I connected with you in the first place a few years ago. But I see this as this spiritual warfare and focusing back on the truth of God and getting back to the basics. I was going to ask you, are you familiar with Eric Metaxas's A Letter to the American Church?
I've not read the letter. I know his name.
Okay. Because it puts a lot of the weight on the American church. Your church is different. I've watched it, and it's much different from the average bear, where issues are not even discussed. But I think we need some sort of being grounded, and we need to be aware. Like what we've talked about here in Ezekiel, to see God's prophecy come to life and to understand that there are antichrists, all over the place. There were when Jesus was here, and John warned us in his epistles that they were going to be there, and we would be fooled. Jesus, Matthew 24, and then so we have to be careful. I think that's the main thing, and we're distracted.
Yes, we are. We're very distracted. Yeah, I keep coming back to God's love. I think that's what it is. None of us deserve his mercy. None of us. But we're so self-righteous so much of the time that we think, well, because I do this and, and the other person does that. Like, yeah, okay. Look, let's be really honest here. There's some areas of my life I'm doing awesome, right? I'm like a saint. But there's other areas where I am completely messed up. And, so I run a Messianic congregation here in Denver, Colorado, called the Way Congregation. And I often remind my people, I'm like, guys, okay, so we're keeping Sabbath, we're eating clean, we're keeping the feasts, and I think God is pleased by those things. But if we think that we're now keeping Torah, and our Sunday brothers are not, we're gravely mistaken, because Jesus chastised the Pharisees for tithing their mint, anise, and cumin, and yet they forgot the weightier matters of the law, which were love, justice, and mercy. Those are the things that he truly cared about. And he said, look, you should do these things without leaving the former undone. In other words, yeah, you should tithe of your anise, mint, and cumin. That's great. Okay. That's part of the commandment. Do it. So he wasn't saying, oh, forget about the law. He wasn't saying that at all. He's saying, but the weightier matters of the law are to love one another and to show mercy. Those are the things that God truly is concerned about. Those are higher priorities than these other things, right? So it doesn't mean we should ignore the lesser ones, but definitely don't forget the weightier ones. I mean, that's what it really comes down to. And I think we get on our pet theologies, we get on our little shtick, and we start looking around and we see people that aren't doing it right. There's all the kinds of discernment ministries out there, and their whole thing is telling the world how wrong everybody but they themselves are, and they just love to say, well, everyone's doing it wrong except me, right?
Oh.
And I'm like, okay. And, I remember I used to read some of those websites, but then I got on the website because I'm the bad guy now. You know why? Because I tell people to keep the Sabbath, and I don't believe in the preacher of rapture anymore. And I mean, those things right there made me into a heretic. And I realized how silly this whole thing is, because I'm like, I'm just trying to do what Jesus said. And I'm not saying that I'm saved because I'm keeping the Sabbath. Not at all. Right. I think I'm saved because God is good. That's it. God is gracious, not because I've achieved something, not because I've towed the line well enough, not because I've, gone to class long enough and I've gotten enough credits. Not at all. None of that stuff. I think it's because of God's unfailing mercy and love that I am set right with him. And I think we need to spend more time, doing introspection and saying, Lord, how can I become more in line with you, instead of worrying about how can my neighbor become more in line with you? And yet we focus much of our time on worrying about our neighbor. Jesus said that too, right? Why do you worry about the speck in your brother's eye when there's a plank in your own? And yet, even though he said it, we still do it again and again and again. So I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what the answer is for the country. For me, I know what the answer is to focus on my walk with the Lord. How can I be more loving? I know lots of people are going to have other theologies. It's okay. I'm not trying to change people. I'm just trying to be loving. I'm trying to walk in the ways that God is revealed with a humble and contrite heart. That's my basic idea.
Well, I love your work, and I think that it keeps people, it keeps pointing back to God, and I think that's the most important thing we can do as Christians, and educate each other on why we're actually here. That's really hit me a lot in the last 20 years. It's not just about just having a good time and just being distracted. It's about learning and then going out and doing for the kingdom and taking ground, not by force. That's another misnomer a lot of people have, but that's not what it's about. So, right. Okay, tell us, is there anything else you want to say about your book? We have a couple more minutes.
Yeah, I think people would really enjoy God's Divorce, the Bible's hidden love story. You can find this on Amazon.com, and it's also as an audiobook, Kindle, print. So there's different ways you can take it in. The response that I've gotten has been overwhelming. People are buying it by the dozen and giving it out to family and friends because it is such a way to help people that maybe you don't understand, like, why don't you, or why are you keeping the Sabbath, or, and the book really isn't geared toward that, but it helps people understand, okay, who you really are as a believer. We're not this new thing, but we're part of this ancient thing. And for me, I mean, there's times when I was writing it, I was weeping because I was like, oh my goodness, it's the heart of God that just kept making me reflect on how awesome he is. So I would encourage people to check that out, God's Divorce. And you can also find me at douglashamp.com, or if you're in the Denver area, please do check us out at thewaycongregation.com.
Mm-hmm. And people, you live stream as well, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yep.
And then you also, I want everybody to know, he has a Thursday night roundtable. Every Thursday night, it's live, so you can comment, join the chat. It's fun. I have a pseudonym, so you never know that I'm there. It's a different. I don't know how many YouTubes I actually have. So anymore. But thank you so much for your time and being here. Wow, there's just so much to talk about and to learn. And just to keep the main thing is what you always remind me every time we talk. No matter how deep we get into an intellectual conversation, the main thing is the main thing.
Amen.
Well, thank you, Dr. Hamp, and God bless you.
Thank you.